Well, welcome everybody to our Spring 2021 webinar. It's sponsored by the Division 15 of the American Psychological Association. And the format for today's webinar is going to be a little different from others in that David and I will be interviewing our two guests just about the landscape of academic publishing in educational psychology. Our guests are Dr. Patricia Alexander and Dr. Danielle McNamara. Dr. Alexander is currently the senior editor for Contemporary Educational Psychology. She is a distinguished university professor, the Jean Mullen Professor of Literacy, and distinguished scholar teacher in the Department of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology at the University of Maryland. Dr. McNamara is currently the founding editor of the new open access journal, Technology, Mind, and Behavior, which is published by the American Psychological Association. She is the professor of psychology and the director of the Science of Learning and Educational Technology Lab at Arizona State University.
And we're going to begin with some questions just about the process of publishing. A lot of these questions came to us from members of our webinar committee and others that are also, at very different stages in their academic careers. So the first one is very broad, and that is simply, what changing trends in publishing have you witnessed during your time as editor, associate editor, or frequent contributor to the literature?
For me, I've been an editor on multiple types of journals, so or genres or domains. So cognitive science, education, learning sciences, learning and instruction, ed psych, and now more technology oriented. Oh, and AI ed, forgot that one. And so, but across them, I would say one trend is there are more journals. So the number of journals that used to be a possibility for a writer, an author, was more limited when when we started our careers. And another aspect of it in terms of publication is that students and postdocs and faculty also have access to doing more proceedings articles, which kind of gear you up for doing journal articles, in my opinion. It's kind of a prep ground. And then the other trend, the number of places one can put work has changed, but then also we have all observed the increasing turn toward open science and registered reports and those kinds of things. And so that when we first started out when it first opened up to have papers that were open access, there was a lot of disdain for it. And now it's become much more widely accepted that one, registered reports, and two, more toward open access and open science. So I think those are the two biggest changes that I've seen across my career. Pat, how about you?
Yeah, I think when I think of trends, I think of those things that are just dramatic trends, those things that have just kind of zoomed up. And then I think of those trends that are kind of iterative, things that wrap around and come back and recycle. And then also things that, looking over the 40-some years I've been doing this, that seem to be as stasis, that they're there, they were there when I got started, they're there now. And I think, Danielle, the one that came to mind first exactly is yours, the proliferation of journals. And the number of submissions that we all get is just continually going like this. When we started CEP, I started CEP in like 2000, I guess. The number of submissions were here, and now that each year they just continue to go up, and that's true for every journal that I am aware of. And I have edited 2, but I'm on 14 journals right now in terms of editorial boards. And so I see those like you do. I see the diversity, but I don't see anything peeling back. I don't see anything like going out of the way. So that was one of them. The other thing is, I think with changes in the ability to analyze data. When I started, we had to enter the data, do punch cards and feed it into a machine. And a lot of the statistics had to be done by hand. Yes, I'm old. Okay, just get that out of the way. But what's happened now is a lot of these analysis, which is also good and bad, you can run extremely complex designs. And you can do it with a quite quick turnaround of the data set. But it also means that a lot of people who are running complex analyses don't really understand them deeply. And so what you have is the ability to do complex analyses without deeply understanding them. And so there's a pro and con on that sort of thing. But when I started doing research in the late 70s, if you got an interaction effect, for example, it was considered to be a bad thing. You didn't want interactions because it messed up any main effect you may have. Nowadays, if you think about the complexity of designs, they're getting extremely complex. I'm also think it's exciting to look at some of the methodological developments we had that we have now. And we don't do just variable-centered analysis, we do person-centered analysis, we do mixed methods, which is increasingly more prevalent. I've gotten into a lot more to Bayesian analyses, which I find theoretically much more intriguing and all of that. But so those are some of the things. What hasn't changed to me is that the US and English language dominant countries still prevail. If you look at who's contributing to journals, you don't get many submissions that make it into the publications from like the global South or from other parts of the world. So that what we report on in research is very much colored by this geography issue. Which is good and bad. I mean, well, no, it's bad. Because we're very narrow in the perspective that we may be bringing to some very important questions. And of course, we'll talk about more, I'm sure, with the open access and that sort of thing, we can bring those up. But the questions we can ask now, at the core, they're the same questions we were asking in the late 70s, but they're much more sophisticated in the way that we ask them.
You know, I want to link
Yeah, go ahead.
one of the things that you said to the Institute for Education Sciences and the number of things, the number of people and projects that they fund. I was funded by the predecessor for IES, and so I got to see the growth when we first started out and being funded. It was a table with 20 people around it. Mm-hmm. That was the meeting. That was the grantees meeting. And then over the years, it grew and grew and grew until now it's thousands of people. And so there is more funding for education researchers. And it is, I mean, obvious education is the least funded area of research of all sciences. Let's say that. Yet, we do have more and than we had in the 80s and 90s. So that's one aspect of it. There are more people doing research. There's more funding, and there's more diversity and complexity in the designs.
Yeah, I would say what I'm going to try to do all the time is think about the pros and cons on each of the questions that you ask. One of the things that I've been concerned a lot about lately is, as an editor, is the number of manuscripts that come across our desks that are 25%, 30%, 35% copied from other places. And that's because right now it's so easy to go online and extract texts in a way that we couldn't do that. Well, we wouldn't have done that, but so that, and sometimes I think it's not done with malice of, in that sort of way, but it's still, plagiarism is becoming rampant in our business, and we have to monitor everything that comes across the desk.
It's true.
Okay, let me come back to something. Dr. McNamara, you brought this up and you spoke a little bit to Dr. Alexander, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the open access journals and the pre-registering studies, et cetera. Do you think that improves the scientific process in educational and psychological sciences? And also, what are some of the ethical implications of these practices?
Sure. So I am currently on a journal, Technology, Mind and Behavior, that is open access and encourages pre-registration. It doesn't require And we also have a route for pre-registration. And I obviously do think that it improves science. It improves, one of the main reasons that I do believe in open access is that it allows individuals from places that don't have access to libraries and journals or funds to access science. And so for us to adequately to be diverse, we have to provide access to everyone to our research. The negative side of that is that it's often hard to couple with the blinding of the authors.
Yeah.
So if you have, I'm sorry, not open access, open science. So if you have pre-registered studies, and if you are giving access to the data during the review process, it cannot be blinded. That's just a fact. And so, because obviously the reviewers are going to be checking the data, and they actually sometimes redo the analyses to check them. And for journals that have blinding of authors, blinding of reviews, which a lot of education journals do, it is, well, you can't do it. You can't, it's very hard to couple them. You can give access afterwards, but that doesn't do the review process any very much good. Then oh, I have another idea, but I forgot it. Pat, what do you have to say?
Let me jump in and I think, of course, in organizations like APA, AERA, APS, you can go down the list, support these open science guidelines. It's meant to improve science. It's meant to increase things like transparency and access. And so I'm going to take that as a baseline, right? And there's many of the components of it that are, for whatever reason, are really fine, like open access journals, except of course they cost a great deal of money to publish in many open access journals. So those people who want to make their work available either have to find supported fundings or whatever. So, but financially it can be a burden for graduate students or for some people who aren't been around a long time and have lots of money to throw away. No, I'm just kidding. But the other side of it for me is, and it's the part that nags at me, and that is that it seems to do this idea of giving badges, for example, or considering what's high quality research based on the fact that you are doing a very mature line of research, like Danielle does all the time. Very mature line of research. You can make these very causal, you can set your hypotheses, you can do all that. I'm a theorist. A lot of what I do as theory develop is to, and it's not that I am playing with the data. I'm not p-hacking, I'm not hacking, I am very richly exploring. But that kind of exploration is extremely demanding. It's extremely hard to theory build. And yet I don't get a badge. And so I'm really not happy that I don't get badges. But it really, I'm afraid if we're not careful, it creates a tier system. It creates a way to give higher ratings to some kind of research and not others. And I think those of us like Danielle and myself and Jason, the rest of you, David, we have to fight against that. We have to give credit and value to all kinds of research in our journals, and not assume simply because you are doing let me say something else too, and then Danielle, I'll turn it back to you. And that is that sometimes I see a cost in what I would call the validity side, on the care that we take to make sure something is done precisely and meticulously. I like to do ecologically valid studies. The classes I teach are in the hundreds, and so I like to actually walk the walk. When I do educational psychology, I do it in my class as part of the class, and I like to examine that sort of thing. But that ecological validity comes at a cost, and that cost is I can't even necessarily make too many predictions about what's going to happen, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I am not, and I do not believe in requiring pre-registration. But, and also when you pre-register a study, I really want to emphasize that that doesn't mean that you won't explore the data. It's a, I think that students often think that if they go beyond the analyses that they hypothesized, then they're cheating or they're not supposed to do that. And that's not science. So as you were saying, Pat, part of it, science is understanding the data, making sense of the data. And if you think that you should not explore something you didn't hypothesize, then that's not very scientific, because your job is to answer questions, and you might have asked the wrong one, and you might have made the wrong prediction. And so your job as a scientist is to make sense of it. So I don't think that pre-registration means that you can only do what you said in the pre-registered study. It is saying, let's say, it gives you a chance to say, if you have a hypothesis that's a little bit controversial and you don't think people are going to believe that you made that hypothesis, then pre-registration gives you the chance to say, no, I really did say this. I really did predict this. I want to go back. I want to go back to the funding issue. I want to say for APA, for Technology, Mind, and Behavior, which is an APA journal, they are covering a large part of the cost, so it's not very expensive. But I also want to say that for anyone who cannot cover the cost, they have the route of explaining why, and then they do not pay a cost. So if they're from a university that doesn't cover these kinds of costs, they don't have grants, if they don't make the kind of money that would be evidently necessary, to fund this kind of thing, that does not prohibit submitting to a journal that has open access. And that was very important to me in order to come on board for Technology, Mind, and Behavior, because that should never be a barrier to publication. And that's the two-way street for open access. It's opening access for everyone.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a professor from ASU and you come in and you say, oh, I can't afford it, no, yes. That's not a good excuse. So that, you have to be careful in how you make those arguments.
Okay, our next question is, what advice you would give people who are relatively new to the publication process? What are the rules of the game that may be just implicit?
Okay, rules of the game. I like that. Let's call them, the laws of the West. I think if you're starting out, the first thing I would say to you is the goal of publishing is to have something of importance to share. One of the worst things in academia is this idea that I'm publishing because if I don't publish, I'm going to not make tenure. I'm not going to keep my job. You always start out by having something, a critical, important message that is important enough to take the time to communicate it, right? With that, so you have your message. With that, you should know whatever the background is for your topic, your issue, your subject extremely well. One of the things that I'm always troubled with is a lot of times, by the way, I didn't mention this, but I'll throw it in now. Desk rejects are very common now in most journals because of the number of submissions, which means it never goes beyond a number of members of the editorial team who review it and say, let's not send this out. And one of the biggest reasons for that is the lack of understanding of your variables, your constructs the theoretical backing for it. And partly because if students haven't been well mentored, they assume that the topic that they need to look at, the literature they need to know, is like 3 or 4 or 5 years old. And that's a death knell for somebody who's going to go to Danielle's journal or mine, because I've been around for 40 some years. Trust me, I know when I get these that say, look, this is the newest thing since sliced bread. And I go, yeah, well, it's as stale as, like last week's whatever. It's because the same ideas, if you don't know the literature, you don't know where the classical studies have been in your field, you will try to replicate something that has been beaten to death in maybe 20 years ago. You must know the roots of your field. And that means reading well and reading deeply. I'm a great believer in philosophy. The philosophical roots of a lot of our constructs are there, but we've lost some of that foundational understanding of education and psychological research, which is kind of sad and dismal. So have a message, know your field well, and for God's sake, know the journal. I cannot tell you how many people submit to journals and it's clear they've never even read the journal. They've never looked at the journal because the tone, what they submit, they'll submit to RER, Review of Educational Research, a non-reviewed piece, or they'll send to something does not accept reviews, they'll send reviews. All they had to do was read the guidelines. They had to look through and become familiar with the journal. That's a good way to just waste your time. The only other thing, and I've got others, but I'll throw it over to Danielle, is make sure, in a sense, that you begin writing with the idea of a family of journals in mind. Don't craft something and then go try to sell it. You know what I mean? Before you sit down to write a piece, what you should do is really think about what family of journals, and what I mean by families, like CEP, JEP, all those journals, learning and instruction, they have kind of a shared sort of family of formattings of topics and that sort of issues. So when you write for a family of journals, if one of them doesn't make it into wherever you target it, you still can have another family of journals to go to. But don't ever write it and then say, okay, now what am I going to do with this? That's going to get you kind of into a corner. Danielle, take it from there, and I'll pick if there's.
No, you stole them all. I tell my students and my postdocs, the purpose of writing a paper is not to have a publication. The purpose is because your obligation as a scientist is to communicate. That's your obligation. Some people paid a lot of money for you to have a PhD and for you to go be a faculty member or a postdoc or a student. And that the deal that you're making is that when I do work, I will communicate my findings, good or bad. And if I have valid findings, we're going to talk about fatal flaws, but if you have valid findings, your job as a scientist is to communicate. And in that realm, just like Pat was saying, what I have my students do if they want to write a paper is just what she was saying. Let's think about where it's going to go. And if they name off a journal, I'll say, okay, your job is to go, read at least 10 articles on this topic from that journal. They have to, every journal has its own feel and genre and writing style. And so if you write a journal, you can't write a paper for Journal of Ed Psych that is the same paper as Learning Sciences. That is a very different paper. The audience is different. So communication involves gauging who your audience is. That's what communication is. And when you're writing a paper, you're talking to somebody, you're communicating to that audience. So I'd say, another thing I'd say is if you're submitting to a particular journal and you aren't citing it, it's the wrong journal.
Yeah.
And also what you haven't done your homework. And there's probably papers in there that you should be citing and you just haven't covered it yet.
Yeah, let me follow up because see, we think so much alike, but one of the things when I help my beginning students who are not experienced writers is I often tell them you have to stop writing for what's in your head. In other words, if you read a lot of what they write when they first begin, they're really just filling in the spaces for what's inside their head. So they don't explain things deeply well. They don't make connections. It's just too shallow of a piece of writing. And that's the mistake. The mistake is you're not writing from what you already know. You're writing for some intelligent novice reader, somebody who doesn't know what you're about, what you're doing, and you need to be patient with that audience and make sure that they understand what you're about and bring them along methodically so they can track where you're taking them. I often said I would also read it aloud to see how it sounds. There's and sometimes I used to read it aloud with my mother in mind, who, she doesn't know much about education, but she has a sense of rhythm and ideas like that. So reading it to someone like that, like you could write something and read it to Grant, your husband, or somebody, some familial person that you can have as a person who will listen to it. Because you've got to get out of yourself. You've got to get out of your head to see what that paper is really saying.
Yeah, I'll tack onto that an example. If you're communicating let's say you have a main effect in your analysis. A common way of doing that is to say there was a main effect of condition A. Well, why don't we put that into English?
Yeah.
And say that X was greater than Y, or the results indicated that there was a benefit to blah over blah. Pretend that in fact people want to understand what you're saying rather than just getting the words. So don't be afraid of words.
Yeah.
Great. So moving to the other side of the publication process, we had a question come up from somebody who's like, well, the review process is kind of blinded in more than one way. And the question is, what suggestions would you give to people as they review journal articles? Which kinds of things should they focus on? Which kinds of things should they, deserve less emphasis? That is, what would make for a really 5-star review as opposed to one that kind of misses the mark?
Well, let me start with that, and then Danielle can correct my errors. But no, one of the things that as an editor you want is somebody to lay out very clearly what the big issues are. Sometimes I receive what I call kind of stream of consciousness or think aloud reviews. In other words, what the person will say is, on page 1, there's a typo here. And on page 3, there's not a clear definition of so-and-so. But that's the way their mind is functioning as they're reading through it. I want to say, here are the critical issues theoretically. Here's the critical issues methodologically. Here's some things that both pro and con about the way they approach the data analysis and the interpretation. Give the editor a clear blueprint of what you consider to be the major issues. You can always mention that there are issues in the editing that require the person to get someone to edit the manuscript if English is not their first language, or if there's problems grammatically, you can point that out. Or formatting is another one that's very, very common. People don't yet know APA at all, much less APA 7th edition or wherever we are. You can point those out, but those are the lower hanging issues relative to the big conceptual methodological sort of issues.
Mm-hmm. I think that, there is a meta structure for reviews. They should all include the summary, and the summary is just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, that we've all understood the same thing, not because the editor isn't reading the paper. And then there's the big issues and the smaller issues. As a reviewer, in terms of being strategic, you can go through and name all the little issues But then remember that your job is to name the bigger issues. In terms, one of the things I want to say though is that what you're looking for also depends on the journal, and there are thresholds for journals. So some journals are only the top things coming in, and when they come in are going to be published because there's so many submissions. Other journals are more mentorship style, where the only thing they're looking for is the fatal flaw. So even the introduction and the conclusion, they don't even have to be that good. They don't even have to be right. But what you're looking for always across all journals is the fatal flaw. Is there a fatal flaw in the methods? And then the bigger issues might be for, to say, well, there's not a match between the theory and the methods. There's not, the introduction seems to be like it's written by somebody else.
Which may be true.
It's probably true. And so there are those issues, but as Pat said, what the editor is looking for is the big picture. And we like to have people go through and do the smaller issues because that cleans it up as we go along, but that's not the main purpose of a review.
Thank you. We're gonna transition to another set of questions, and these questions are going to be about sort of research in educational psychology in general, the broader questions. And so this next question I'm going to ask is, what types of studies in lines of inquiry are you really excited to see get published in the next decade?
In the next decade. I'll be in my 90s. No, I'm just kidding. I think for me personally, I'd like to see many more in-class studies carried out in classrooms rather than us doing laboratory type studies. I think everything has to start at a certain level, I realize. And in some cases, you start in a much more controlled sort of environment, but then eventually you want something to function in classrooms in ways that facilitate, if that's what you're looking at. That would be one of the things I would want to see and that I'm excited about. I do think the better marriage of quantitative and qualitative that I've seen in some of the very well done mixed methods is encouraging. And I think it sets aside the old, are you quant or qual argument, because there's so much that can be done, I think, these days to enrich the numbers that we put on the page that give us a deeper understanding of what the results will mean. I think one of the things that I would like to see more that I'm excited about is we still have issues with how to get to some of the deeper constructs that matter to us greatly. Some of the most common constructs in our field is educational psychologist motivation, knowledge, learning. Those sorts of things are not always transparent. They're so buried and so hidden. And if we can increasingly improve the sophistication of our data analytic techniques, but we need to find better and more, I think, exciting ways to unearth what's going on in the minds of individuals. And maybe some of the new techniques, biophysiological marriage with others will be one of those avenues.
I will preface this by saying that if Pat and I can predict or say what we want in a decade, then we're not doing very well, as I expect scientists to be more creative. And, I don't think we know now what we're going to need in 5 years. I can say that another thing, and in addition to what Pat was talking about that we need, we've been blatantly faced with the fact that online learning is really bad, and our understanding of online learning is really poor. And what we thought we understood, we did not. And so that's one of the aspects of educational research that I think needs to be improved. And also doing a better job of linking together data from different sources and across different platforms so that we can have a bigger picture of students across different, there are many online platforms. And one of the objectives in sight is to do a better job linking them and providing access to that data, providing researchers with access to platforms that might be commercial, providing teachers with better access to these kinds of platforms. The other thing I will say, it echoes along the lines of what Pat is saying, is that we really need to do a better job of communicating with the instructors and the teachers, and bridging the researchers, and commercial platforms, designers, and the actual instructors, the people in the classrooms, be them online or be them in a physical classroom, and communicating, listening, and understanding what they need. I think I heard that when I was a budding researcher in the 90s, and I didn't listen. I've always had, listened to had focus groups and had teachers involved, but we still have a long way to go before we really create this collaborative environment that brings together multiple disciplines and people from multiple viewpoints.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you, Danielle, on all those facets. Can I make a wish list of what I want to see instead of saying what's going to happen?
Yeah.
One of the things is, and I will nod to people like Delion Gray and Jamal and Jamal Matthews and other people who are trying to make us aware of the fact that we have treated things like culture, ethnicity, gender so very poorly in our research as educational psychologists. We throw them in as covariates, or we do something to adjust for them, or we claim diversity because we have a population of this many percentage of this and that. And I really think that my wish list of what I want to see is a much more meaningful integration of those factors that are so critical to understand as we go into classroom settings. That's one of the things that I'm desperate to see, and I'm hoping it'll be there.
Yeah, that's a great segue, Dr. Alexander, because the next question that deals with that exactly, which is, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'd love to get your thoughts about, as editors, as reviewers, as other gatekeepers to EdPsych, like, what do we do so that we are part of the solution rather than part of the problem?
I think that's a brilliant question. Danielle, I'll let you go first.
Well, one of the things to keep in mind is that there's a good deal of research showing that the selections committees, for example, for an award, if you have all of one race and gender, the awardee will be of that race and gender. And that, to the degree that you think about who is on a committee, and in this case, a review board, an editorial board, or your invited reviewers, diversity doesn't happen by chance. I mean, it's not going to just kind of like come out of there. You have to do it actively and decisively. You have to make rules in your head or openly. As an example, when I was the president of the Society for Text and Discourse, as soon as I came on, I made a written rule: all committees have to be equal in gender. And that goes beyond that in the technology, mind, and behavior. It's more of an international journal, and all of the, I always think about where are the reviewers, not only gender, but what part of the world are they? Am I representing different parts of the world and different ways of thinking about things? So as an editor, it's something that we definitely need to actively think about.
Yeah, for a long time, it was true that women had to fight to get kind of leadership roles in journals. That now has been, I think, dealt with fairly well. But we are still not doing right by issues of race and ethnicity and culture as well. So Danielle, it's hard. We don't want to abuse the scholars that we have and we constantly turn to in our field, and we do that because their voices matter to us. But it's not fair that we constantly draw on them in such ways. But we need a younger generation, and that younger generation begins with how we recruit new doctoral students, how we bring them into the fold. There's many universities, colleges, and programs where it's still predominantly white. The questions asked are asked not only by whites, but they're blinded by that sort of issue. And not that there's anything wrong with being all I'm saying is we have to really mean what we say and not simply play numbers. We have to get deep into the issue. And we can do that. We can certainly do that.
I appreciate that. That's thank you for commenting on that. And I think that as I'm looking at time and noticing that it's 2:45. I think what we can do is I'd love to give the two of you a chance to talk a little bit more big picture about yourself and in your role as as a scholar, as an editor, and what would you like people to see as your editorial legacy?
Oh, my editorial legacy? I think my goal has been to find young scholars and to nurture them and bring them forward. And so I've always made it a point of trying to find scholars just coming out of programs. Yourself, Jason, people like Krista Muse, you can name them. They were people I watched as doctoral students come forward, and giving them the platforms. They were ready. I mean, like they just give them a chance, let them show what they can do and know, but they need to be given chances and opportunities, and that's one of the legacies I want to see. As an editor, I think my legacy is I probably am one of the rarities in our field because I've been editing since the 1990s continually. I've been editor of CEP for 20 years, and I will be stepping down. It was kind of like giving up your child for adoption, but it's time, but I think my legacy is I kind of wanted to nurture the field for a long time, and I hopefully have done that. I leave having done the best job I could possibly do. I leave behind such wonderful young scholars who are now themselves all mature and full professors and bringing around their own generation of students. To me, that's the most important legacy, that I was fair, I was open, that the reviews or the criticisms, as well as the things that I say on paper to the people who submit to the journal becomes instructive, and not just judgmental in a way.
Thank you.
I'd say the same thing. I was going to say fairness and kindness, and I'll move on from there to say that it's been quite a bit. It's quite a different experience for me being an associate editor versus an editor. As an associate editor, I don't think I really had the tie to the journal as much. Whereas for the journal I'm editor of now, I in essence, every single paper that comes in is like, I feel like it's a gift. They're giving me something. And I want to treat that gift with as much respect and fairness as I can, given, you know, time constraints of reviewers and the whole editorial process. But I'm excited about the papers that come in, and I want to be fair. And then in technology mentor, mind and behavior, I view it as a mentorship journal. So I want to be able to nurture them through the process if they're junior authors, and they're, in particular, if they're junior authors. And so that's what I love about that process, is helping the authors to communicate what they need to communicate.
Yeah, I think perhaps those who know me well would say my legacy is that I'm fair and just, but I'm also hard. And I don't know, changing arms are not so hard, so readily. But that, you know, I'm very passionate about my ideas, and I am a strong mentor to my own students, meaning I'm not always, I want to be frank and open and honest with them. And sometimes that's a strong message to receive, but I try to frame it with enough nurturing that at least you can handle it much better. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
It does.
Well, one thing I would say about myself is that I think it would be a lie for me to claim I'm not critical. I'm critical, and I also I demand coherence, and I
guess so, that your research. No.
Yeah, it does. And when I'm listening to a story, everything has to come to make sense, and the story has to make sense. And I do view writing a paper is you're writing a story for
Yes.
an audience, and it has to make sense, and all the pieces have to come together.
Absolutely. I think right now is a great time to transition to questions that have been coming up in the chat feature.
Great.
And I'll kind of go through them. So David and I will go back and forth. So the first question I'll ask is, somebody said, Dr. Alexander, I appreciate you highlighting the problem of research coming from English dominant countries as being a majority. And this person said, I've been told that editing services have declined over the years. Do you think publishers will be more willing to put more financial resources into changing that?
Oh, that's spot on. It used to be that every manuscript would get copy edited in the old days. That's what I meant by there were fewer pieces coming in, and the publishing companies would have people who would actually blue pencil your manuscripts. You don't see anything like that anymore. Even if you ask for a manuscript to get special attention, it just doesn't happen. The truth of the matter is, publishing companies, first of all, you understand publishing companies are going to have to go through a lot of transformation at the same time. One being that I don't think we're going to see paper versions of journals much longer, except for maybe for libraries. So it's a very different transition. And publishing companies need to make money, and their services have dwindled. And I don't think, in truth, that we can expect them to provide those services. That means we have to come up as a community to figure out how to do this. I've had some conversation with Karen Murphy, for example, who's coming in after me as editor of CEP, and a way of how to select and do some mentoring pieces. Select pieces from maybe the global South, or other places in the world that need that kind of mentoring to bring them along, and earmark some of those and provide those services ourselves. We're going to have to do it as a community, because I don't think the editorial places will do it. Now, some institutions are excellent at this. They will provide those kind of aids and services, but when those aren't there, somebody has to help. Somebody has to help.
Okay, we had a few questions about impact factors. I'm going to try to sum them all up here together. And that's perspectives about impact factors for journals, which differ by discipline and areas, but are also increasingly used as a metric for faculty annual promotion reviews and evaluations. How should areas and fields use this type of metric? Should it also, would you recommend using it to seek outlets, publication outlets?
Danielle, you want to go first and then I'll give you.
Sure. I hate impact factors. If I don't, what I hate about them is the impact they have on students and junior authors in the current age. If I had had my career based on whether I was seeking out journals with specific impact factors, I never would have survived. It goes completely against what we were talking about earlier, that what you're doing is you want to communicate something to an audience and you choose the audience. But impact factors are a part of life now. They have found a shortcut to describing whether a piece of research or science or a theoretical paper has importance by linking it to the journal itself. I only recently consider impact factor in where I submit, and only because I have to consider the careers of the students that I work with. So as a scientist and a mentor, I really dislike them. I think that they really focus authors on the publication process and not the communication process. It focuses departments on numbers instead of the content of the actual paper or what the paper did. I feel less strongly about citation rates. Right. So whether or not a paper is cited, I think is a valid metric for the degree to which it was replicated and had impact on other authors and scientists to some degree. Sometimes it gets a little out of hand. And so it's just it's the way it's done now. Do I like it? No. Of course, I'm currently an editor on a journal that has no impact factor.
Yeah.
And so, it takes a journal for years or so and to get an impact factor. And maybe that's one reason why every paper that comes in, it's like, oh, you're giving me a gift. That's so nice of you. And they're great gifts. Like, it's excellent research. So, that's what I think.
Yeah, as I got to be chair of the University of Maryland Promotion and Tenure Committee, which is a major responsibility because I look at all disciplines and tenure track and non-tenure track. And it's still true today that there are metrics that are going to show up that are expected to be present in dossiers for promotion and tenure. And that I also I reviewed, I think, 8 cases for going up for full this year alone, that all these places report the impact factor of journals, your H indices, and metrics are unavoidable. They're unavoidable. But there's a few bright spots I can say about how to deal with them. One of them is sometimes you can talk about what is the top 4 journals in this area that you're looking at, which is outside of the realm of the impact factor. If it's an association journal, for example, it's the main association for your field, there are ways to talk around the impact of a particular outlet beyond the impact factor. There's also, I think, certain ways my students and I have always been very concerned about always starting with a literature review of in-depth examination of whatever we're going to be studying next, whatever line of inquiry we're doing. And it serves us because we need to know that field anyway. So we go as deep as we can and as broad as we can in looking at reviews of the constructs that we're interested in. And I think it's almost always a case that these review journals have the highest impact factors and the longer shelf life for the degree to which your paper becomes cited. So it serves that number game, but it more importantly serves you as laying a foundation for what you're going to be doing. And RER, EPR, I'm talking jargon, sorry about that. As psychologists, all those journals have immensely high impact factors because they really do have the ability to pull ideas together that other people will want to turn to. So I would suggest for all of those who are facing promotion and tenure in some time in the future, and you still have an important line of inquiry that matters to you, think about that. Think about reviews, whatever kind system, whether it's a meta analytic, it's a hybrid review, it's a systematic review. They all have value for you, and then they will also help in that sort of issue.
Great, thank you. I think we can ask one last question because I know that we're at the hour mark, and folks are going to be kind of moving away. But I wanted to ask one last question. It could be a short answer, and then we can wrap things up. I know why you laughed. Yes. Here's the question. It's a yes or no question. Is it too late for an older researcher who has worked in the school system in private schools to become an educational psychology researcher?
No, never too late. As a matter of fact, probably just very quickly to justify that statement, you match yourself up with somebody else. Draw your expertise and bring your expertise to bear. You will inform and enrich the research that's going on. No, of course it's not.
Yeah, and I'll also say that getting another degree is overrated. You have so much expertise and knowledge to offer. And one of the things that researchers need more of is partners who have been in the educational system. So to echo what Pat said, we really need people who have had a lot of experience in the classroom in order to improve our research.
Okay, well, yeah, sadly, it looks like that's all the time we have now. So, Dr. Alexander, Dr. McNamara, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming to us and sharing your insights with me, giving your prolific careers in publishing and research. We'd also like to thank Division 15 committee for all their help in preparing this. They actually helped us with some of the questions for this, et cetera. So we really thank you. And finally, to the attendees, thank you for dealing with yet another Zoom meeting. I'm sure you've had several already today to see two of the top scholars in our field.